He told me I'd crossed the line. He said I'd interfered. He fired me 5 minutes before the board convened. What he didn't know was that the conference system was still routing audio to the compliance archive, my archive. The acquisition call from that morning, the $2.1 billion Meridian buyout, was still recorded. His own words would be waiting in the room that was about to judge him. My name is Mia Calder. At 8:34 on a Thursday morning, I was the head of quantitative integrity at Hawthorne Meridian Power, a role I'd built from an empty cubicle to a small team and a big reputation. I walked down the 33rd floor corridor toward the glass-walled boardroom, laptop tucked under my arm, a final version of the risk reconciliation pulsing on screen. The spreadsheet was tidy, mercilessly precise, the $2.1 billion figure written in a cell that had begun to feel less like a valuation and more like a prayer. That spreadsheet, it turned out, was the reason I was being erased. The executive wing felt different that morning. Not busy, not energetic, but taut and watchful, like an animal listening for prey. My shoes clicked on terrazzo tile, each sound announcing something I couldn't yet name. Through the glass I could see them. Julian Crowe, our CEO for the last 14 months, seated at the head of the long obsidian table. To his right, Elena Price, general counsel, with a face like an editorial cartoon of composure. To his left, Naomi Chase from HR, clutching a slim manila packet with fingers that trembled just a fraction. The room's smart screen glowed with the Hawthorne Meridian emblem, a cold teal that washed over them like moonlight on a shark skin. They looked prepared, like an inquisition waiting for its victim. I pushed the door open. Julian's smile slid across his face, polite and practiced, but his eyes were flat and distant. "Mia, come in," he said. "Close the door." The silence condensed until it felt almost physical. I set my laptop down, the models still visible on the screen, ready to walk them through the risk vectors tied to Meridian's Midwestern field, the one the sell side had framed as a growth engine. I had flagged it as critical. Field 14's production numbers were optimistic. I thought I was there for a last-minute, friendly check-in before the 9 o'clock board review. Julian's tone had the casual lilt of a man pouring coffee. "We've decided to let you go," he said. It landed in my chest like a misfiled ledger. For a moment, the words had no meaning. They were language and quotation marks. I looked to Naomi for the reflex confirmation that this was some horrid prank. Her eyes were on the table, fixed on a grain in the wood, as if answers might materialize there. Elena pushed a thin packet across the table with a measured tap. "This is your separation agreement. It's generous, contingent on non-disparagement and confidentiality." The second clause was already a net. I asked what grounds they were citing. Julian recited it like a script. Repeated overstepping of authority during the Meridian acquisition prep. Overstepping. The word was so pre-canned it felt almost comical. I'd spent months building the valuation model, writing code that stitched together 6 years of satellite imagery, maintenance manifests, and raw production logs. I'd stress-tested every assumption. My models had stopped false euphoria before. They were meant to save shareholder value, not court it. I swallowed the laugh that wanted out and let it harden into a coiled, cool anger. "Overstepping where?" I asked. "In the model that flagged Field 14 as a systemic overstatement? In the forecast that lowered the synergy multiple by 30%? A tiny flicker crossed Julian's face. Annoyance. Then annoyance's disguise. Disdain. He was a salesman crowned. He liked the altar his charisma built. I had come to be the wet blanket around his ceremonial bonfire. Naomi's voice trembled. "Mia, please, let's not escalate this." Her gaze kept sliding away. She was terrified of being contaminated by my integrity. Elena clicked her pen against the folder. The sound was the corporate metronome. "Security will escort you to your office to retrieve your personal effects. We will disable your network access." Vaporous finality. Wiped access, the blink of an account termination. In 5 minutes, 7 years of work could be reduced to a cardboard box. I looked at the laptop screen and felt the absurdity of how a lifeless device could be the last repository of truth. I'd authorized the company's boardroom teleconferencing for strict compliance recording months ago. The system boasted continuous encrypted archival mapped to an off-site compliance server. They revoked my keys, but they hadn't revoked the archive. They had removed the person, but they hadn't removed the process I set in motion. The security guard took me to my office. I packed a framed photo of my mother, a battered paperback of some finance classic, a small bronze award with my name gone matte from handling. It took less than 10 minutes. On the wall, the conference console, Meridian Cast, blinked a tiny green light, a call in progress. My throat go dry. My analytic mind, the same one they'd accused of being obsessive, slid into gear. The board meeting was scheduled to start in 15 minutes. The Meridian live call from earlier, the one where Julian had dismissed my concerns, was on that cache. They were methodical about erasing me. Access revoked, email cut off, key card disabled. They had followed the corporate dismissal playbook perfectly, but they left one human error. The person who could stop the compliance feed, the person with the authorization to manually end archival sessions, had been dismissed. I had been that person. I stowed my box in a locker at the transit hub and walked toward the coffee cart on the plaza across from Hawthorne Meridian's tower. I needed a vantage point, a place to watch them without being seen. The plan that mapped itself in my head was clinical, surgical. I pulled out my phone and opened a secure remote admin portal I'd built during the Meridian Cast installation. My executive credentials were gone, but the systems account tied to the original install, the one I'd kept for maintenance, was active. An oversight. A fatal oversight. The live feed was crisp in my ear. Julian's voice filled the room across the street, confident, oily, practiced. I heard him welcome the board, hear the Meridian negotiators gush about reserves and synergy. My fingers, trained to move on data, moved now without thinking, on my phone. In the admin interface, I navigated to the server-side audio cache. There it sat, audio captured 10:07 a.m., the 7 o'clock a.m. call. I didn't download it. I didn't need to. I routed the cached clip to the boardroom playback source, switched the playback mode to loop, and hit apply. The trap was not about exposure alone. It was about acoustics. When the chairman called the meeting to order, the boardroom speakers would not relay Julian's live voice. They would instead deliver a recording of him, candid, unguarded, telling his inner circle what he considered a safe secret. He would say aloud what he'd only ever said behind closed doors. That Field 14's numbers were manufactured, abridged to justify a $2.1 billion price tag. That the audit would never dig deep, that the board didn't need to know. I sat in a small cafe, a paper cup cooling at my elbow, and waited. Across the street, the tower's windows were a polished grid of oblivious light. My phone buzzed. Clara, the board assistant, texted, "Meeting is called to order, chairman opening remarks." My heart didn't race, it measured. This was what months of meticulous record-keeping were for. Not drama, but inevitability. Julian began. I could hear the smooth cadence of his practice pitch, then the patch of audio that made me inhale like someone underwater, him lowering his voice to the conspiratorial register he reserved for confidants and liars. He was just at Field 14. It's a small tweak. They won't audit that far. The market wants a story, not the messy truth. I watched the little progress bar on my screen crawl to completion. The feed looped. The voice in the boardroom became the same voice who had fired me that morning. It replayed his contempt, his instructions, his admission, and when it finished, it started again. An echo, unending, inexorable. The room I had been thrown from would hear him confess, then hear it again and again until there was nowhere left to hide. My thumb hovered over the message to Clara. Then I tapped a single line. I pressed play. Her reply came back in 3 dots that felt like detonators. Across the plaza, the building changed, not physically, but in a way that I could feel, a tilt in its gravity. Men who'd leaned on Julian's charisma were suddenly listeners to their own complicity. The first phone vibration was Julian, then another, a text from Elena, then a call labeled bored. I didn't answer anything. I sat very still, folded into myself like a machine cooling down. 2 minutes later, Clara's final line arrived. "It's over. Chairman adjourned. Emergency session called." The $2.1 billion plan collapsed on its own axis, folded inward by sound. I put the phone away, the paper cup bitter and untouched. For the first time in 7 years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, but the clean, cold satisfaction of equations that balance. The echo I'd named on a dusty drive had become a gavel. I stood, pocketed my phone, and walked away from the tower while the city around me went about a day that now belonged to someone else. They'd fired me for crossing lines. They didn't realize I'd been guarding the margins where truth hides. Somewhere on that 33rd floor, a loop was playing Julian Crowe's confession on repeat. He hadn't yet seen the fall. He'd only just spoken the sentence that would make him fall. The rest would be the consequences. And beyond the glass, the boardroom speakers kept looping his voice, his admission, his undoing. I walked into the river of the city and let it carry me. The game had changed. The echo had begun. The next morning, the city looked ordinary, which made it feel wrong. People carried coffees, taxis honked, and screens above the plaza scrolled numbers that didn't yet know they were lies. But inside Hawthorne Meridian's upper floors, panic was spreading like a silent contagion. I knew because Clara called at 8:03 a.m., whispering from a stairwell. He's locked in with the board. They brought in outside counsel. Julian looks, she hesitated, as though describing a car wreck. He looks cornered. I didn't answer immediately. I was sitting in my small apartment in River Point, laptop open to a blank document titled Statement of Fact. I hadn't slept. My mind kept replaying that moment, his voice looping in the boardroom, the sudden stillness that must have followed. They know the numbers were falsified? I asked. Clara exhaled, shaky. They know enough to question everything. They're demanding the original reconciliation models. My heart gave a small, almost imperceptible jolt. And Julian? He says you hacked the system. Of course he did. Classic damage control. Turned the accuser into the accused. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct I had was trained for precision, evidence, audit trails. I didn't rage, I documented. Within minutes, I began assembling files, metadata logs, authorization timestamps, and correspondence chains proving he'd approved those projections himself. I'd backed up everything on a private drive long before the termination. What I hadn't yet decided was whether to release it. The call from Julian came 2 hours later. His number was still saved, though the name Julian C. now looked like a scar on my screen. I let it ring twice before answering. You made your point, he said tight, breathless. Congratulations. You've tanked the stock by 15% in 24 hours. I hope you're proud. I smiled faintly, though he couldn't see it. I didn't tank it. You did when you built a deal on false data. He laughed short and humorless. You think you can play hero? They'll bury you for data theft, Calder. You used a backdoor account. That's federal territory. So is securities fraud, I said evenly. The silence that followed was long enough to hear the city traffic outside my window. You don't want to do this, he said finally, softer now, almost pleading. We can fix it. Let me clean it up. I'll make sure you're reinstated, compensated. You're offering hush money. I'm offering survival, he snapped. They don't care about truth, Mia. They care about stability. You're a disruptor, and disruptors don't last. The line went dead before I could answer. I stared at the phone, the screen still glowing, then typed 3 words into my statement draft. He threatened silence. By afternoon, the media caught wind. Whistleblower sabotages billion-dollar deal, one headline read. Another, CEO accused of data manipulation. They didn't name me yet, but the tone was set. Female analyst gone rogue, data manipulation scandal, internal war. My inbox overflowed with reporters' requests, LinkedIn messages from strangers, and one short email from the Securities Oversight Bureau. We'd like to speak with you regarding the Meridian acquisition data integrity. That was when I realized this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about record. The truth had become public currency, and I was holding a fortune no one wanted spent. That night I went to meet Clara at a 24-hour diner near the waterfront. She looked exhausted, eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. The board suspended Julian, she whispered over her coffee. They're freezing the acquisition until a full audit. He's furious, says you'll regret this. Regrets and efficient, I said, trying to sound composed, but my hands trembled on the mug. They'll come after me legally, won't they? He's already hired attorneys, but the chairman, he asked for your files. I nodded slowly. Then he'll have them. Clara looked alarmed. Mia, if you give them that data, you're out in the open. You'll be the face of it. Good, I said. Someone should be. The next morning, I drafted a 12-page report attaching every verifiable data trail. Emails, revision logs, compliance documentation. I included one key line in the cover letter. All conclusions are derived directly from system metadata, verifiable by Hawthorne Meridian's own infrastructure. It wasn't vengeance. It was architecture. Truth built on timestamps. When I hit send to the board's compliance address, the email felt heavier than any weapon. Within the hour, a subpoena request appeared in my inbox from federal auditors. They wanted me on record. The moment I stepped into their gray office 2 days later, the air smelled like dust and cold coffee. The lead investigator, a woman named Dana, shook my hand and said, "You're very calm for someone about to dismantle a $2 billion deal." "Calm as habit," I replied. They asked everything: how I discovered the discrepancies, when I reported them, what Julian said, why I had access after termination. I told them the truth. I didn't embellish. By the time I left, dusk had fallen, and the headlines had changed tone again. Insider source confirms CEO misled investors. Data scientists vindicated. My apartment felt foreign that night. My phone kept buzzing. Calls from numbers I didn't know. All ignored. In the dark, my reflection in the window looked like someone who'd been peeled out of her own life, but the fear that used to control me was gone. In its place was something simpler: inevitability. The truth had already breached the walls. I didn't need to fight it anymore. It was moving on its own, through inboxes, across boardrooms, into the world. Julian had built his empire on illusion. I had simply removed the curtain. And somewhere downtown, in a corner office stripped of power, I knew he was listening to that loop again, his voice admitting everything, the same words that started it all. The ripple had become a tide, and it wasn't stopping. Julian didn't disappear quietly. By Monday morning, my name was on every news crawl, twisted into a dozen versions of the same accusation. Disgruntled ex-employee leaks confidential data. Hawthorne Meridian's PR department was feeding the press sound bites like poisoned breadcrumbs, all crafted to paint me as unstable, vindictive, a woman who couldn't handle authority. It was classic: erase credibility before truth takes root. My phone buzzed nonstop, but one message froze me. Cease and desist. You are hereby notified that your unauthorized disclosure constitutes breach of NDA. Signed by Hawthorne Meridian Legal. I read it twice, then laughed. They'd built their empire on falsified projections, and now they were quoting corporate policy at me like scripture. But the laugh didn't last long. Legal letters have a way of reminding you how small you are against a system. That evening, I met my attorney, an old friend named Ryan Brooks, at a quiet bar near the courthouse. He had the steady patience of someone used to watching people fall apart. I slid the letter across the table. "They're trying to muzzle me," I said. He read it slowly, then looked up. "They're panicking. It's a preemptive strike. Can they win? Depends how much truth you've got." I smiled faintly, enough to sink $1 billion acquisition. He leaned back. "Then we let them shoot first. When they do, we counterclaim." I sipped me drink. The burn grounded me. Julian's not just defending the company, he's defending his legacy. He'll weaponize anything. Ryan nodded. "Then you need to be untouchable. Every claim you make has to have receipts." "I have receipts," I said quietly. "All of them." The next day, I saw what real retaliation looked like. My professional network began collapsing in real time. Messages from recruiters rescinded, consulting offers withdrawn, colleagues suddenly unable to comment. The whisper campaign had begun. Julian's reach was deep. Every corridor I'd once built a reputation in was now flooded with doubt. She hacked the system. She doctored data. She wanted a payout. Lies spread faster than memos. By Thursday, I couldn't walk 2 blocks without seeing my own face on a newsstand, my name misspelled under headlines about corporate espionage. Ryan called that afternoon. "They filed a temporary injunction," he said. "They're claiming your access after termination violates federal wiretapping laws." I went cold. "They're saying I'm a criminal." "It's theater," he said. "They're throwing mud to see what sticks. But even theater can destroy reputations." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to the river where the city's skyline shimmered like broken glass in the water. My mind ran loops of everything I'd done, every file I'd preserved, every code key I'd left behind. I'd acted ethically, legally, transparently. But I also knew how narratives worked. The court of public opinion didn't run on evidence, it ran on noise. And Julian was a maestro of noise. The next morning, I decided to fight differently. I drafted a public statement, not defensive, but factual. I did not hack Hawthorne Meridian. I accessed compliance infrastructure that I myself created. The data I disclosed was factual, unaltered, and verified. Integrity isn't insubordination. It's accountability. Ryan reviewed it, not at once, and hit send to every major outlet. Within hours, it trended. People began sharing it with captions like, "Finally, someone speaking truth to power." Whistleblower groups reached out. Former employees sent me messages of support, some anonymously, some brave enough to use their names. For the first time, I felt the tide shift. Then Julian made his move.
Late that night, a video surfaced online. A security feed from the day of my termination, showing me in the boardroom, voice raised, eyes bright with fury, saying, "You can't hide this forever." No sound before or after. Cropped, edited, stripped of context. Within minutes, headlines screamed, "Leaked footage shows analyst outburst." The narrative twisted again. Unstable, they called me. Emotional. That was the weapon they always used against women who refused to obey. But I wasn't panicking. I was documenting. I traced the leak's metadata to an internal Hawthorne server. It was a sanctioned release, dressed up as exposure. They wanted to bury me in my own fire. Instead, they gave me a match. I contacted Dana, the federal investigator. I told her, "You need to see this. That footage was edited by Hawthorne's internal media team." She was silent for a moment, then said, "Send it." An hour later, she called back. "We verified your metadata trail. The company's trying to obstruct." Her tone was clinical, but I could hear it, the thrill of a case cracking open. "We'll be issuing subpoenas by morning." I exhaled. Not relief, but something sharper. Vindication. By sunrise, Julian's counterstrike had backfired. News broke that federal investigators were examining Hawthorne's internal manipulation of evidence. My statement, once dismissed as noise, became the spine of the story. The stock fell another 12%. Julian's face appeared on cable news that evening, pale, jaw locked, denying everything with the same arrogance that used to command applause. He said, "The board stands behind me." But behind that line was fear. I could see it in the twitch of his left hand, the way he gripped the desk too hard. He was unraveling in real time. And I wasn't done, because beneath the surface of his empire, buried in the compliance archives, was something even bigger. Emails that didn't just prove deception, but conspiracy. I'd stumbled onto them weeks before the firing, tucked between spreadsheets like rotten marble. I hadn't realized then how deep they ran. Now I was ready to dig. The war had stopped being about my name. It had become about theirs. And the deeper I went, the more I understood. Julian hadn't just made a mistake worth billions. He'd built a culture that worshipped it. The only thing left to do was light the match.
The night I found the deep file, rain hammered the city like static. I was at my desk, surrounded by open folders and half-drunk coffee, when I remembered something from months earlier, a project Julian had greenlit quietly, labeled only Pipeline Optimization Private. It had been excluded from the share network, stored on a restricted server behind a second layer of encryption. At the time, I'd thought it was just corporate compartmentalization. Now I knew better. I dug through my backups until I found an access hash linked to that project. It was old, almost forgotten, but it still pinged alive when I tried it. The folder opened. Inside were hundreds of documents, contracts, emails, projections, all marked confidential. At first glance, they looked routine, but the deeper I read, the colder I became. The optimization wasn't optimization at all. It was a cover. Hawthorne Meridian had falsified environmental impact data on several of their new drilling sites. The efficiency projections I'd seen before were built on doctored reports, hiding leaks and contamination levels that should have shut down operations months ago. They hadn't just lied to investors, they'd lied to regulators. And Julian had signed every approval. I scrolled through PDF after PDF, finding his digital signature like a stain on every page. The implications were staggering, not just financial fraud, but environmental violations on a federal scale. It was no longer a corporate scandal. It was a criminal conspiracy. My pulse pounded. I copied the files to an encrypted drive and sat back, staring at the screen. The truth was radioactive now, enough to destroy entire careers, topple stock values, maybe even lead to indictments. But I couldn't release it recklessly. Evidence is a scalpel, not a bomb. I called Ryan. "You're not going to believe what I found," I said. He arrived within an hour, his expression a mix of fatigue and disbelief, as I showed him the documents. He read in silence for several minutes, then looked at me, jaw set. "This is beyond whistleblowing," he said. "This is federal crimes territory." "I know. You can't leak this online. You have to go through the bureau. If this goes public wrong, they'll bury it as corporate noise." "Julian's still talking to the press," I said. "Every word he says is a lie." "Good," Ryan said. "Let him talk. The louder he gets, the harder he'll fall."
The next morning, I walked into the Securities Oversight Bureau again, this time with the encrypted drive in my hand. Dana met me at the door, her expression unreadable. I slid the drive across the table. "You might want to sit down before you open that." She did, and the color drained from her face as she scrolled. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "Do you realize what this means?" "I do," I said quietly. "Julian's been manipulating more than numbers." Within hours, everything changed. A joint investigation team from environmental enforcement and securities law convened. They requested access to Hawthorne servers, issued warrants for internal communications, and froze executive accounts pending review. By noon, news vans were parked outside the tower. The headlines evolved again. Federal investigators raid Hawthorne Meridian headquarters. CEO Julian Crowe under criminal investigation. The empire was cracking in public view. I watched it unfold from my apartment, the television painting the room in cold blue light. Julian's face appeared on every network, his polished mask finally fracturing. Reporters swarmed him as he exited his building, shouting questions he couldn't dodge. "Did you falsify reports? Did you authorize environmental data manipulation?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Later that day, Ryan called. "You just triggered the biggest corporate audit in 10 years, he said. "They're calling it the Crow collapse." I didn't collapse it. He did. I just stopped holding it up. But the victory didn't feel clean. Whistleblowing isn't triumph, it's amputation. You cut something off to save what's left. I'd lost my job, my anonymity, maybe my career, but I'd also exposed a system that thought it could build profit on poison. That night, Clara called from an unknown number. Her voice was hushed, trembling. "He's looking for you, Mia. Julian. He's not taking this quietly. He says he'll fix it himself." What does that mean? I don't know, but he's angry, not scared, furious. I looked out the window, rain streaking the glass like cracks. "Let him come," I said. "The truth doesn't flinch." The next morning, a car was parked across the street from my building, a black sedan with tinted windows. It didn't move for hours. I noticed the same car again that night, engine running, lights off. Ryan wanted me to call the police, but part of me knew this was Julian's style. He wanted to intimidate, not harm. He wanted control, the one thing he'd lost. Days passed, the investigation deepened. Subpoenas went out, executives were called in. I kept to myself, documenting everything, waiting for the next move. It came on a Friday afternoon, a letter hand-delivered to my apartment. No return address, just my name typed in all caps. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence. "You don't understand what you've started." The handwriting was his. I sat at my table for a long time, the letter trembling in my hands. Maybe he was right. Maybe I didn't understand the scale of what I'd unleashed. But as I looked at the skyline beyond my window, the rain easing into silence, I knew one thing for certain. It was too late to stop now. The deep file was out, the machine was in motion, and the truth had its own momentum. Julian could stalk, threaten, deny, but he couldn't reverse the gravity of exposure. His empire had been built on a lie, and I had finally introduced it to daylight. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning to show its teeth.
There's a peculiar stillness that follows destruction. It's not silence exactly. It's the echo of chaos settling. The moment after a building collapses, when the dust still hangs in the air, but gravity has already chosen its winners. That's what the city felt like 3 weeks later. Hawthorne Meridian was in freefall. The board dissolved Julian's position within 48 hours of the federal raid. His resignation letter was public but meaningless. Everyone knew he'd been forced out. The company's stock had plummeted to a fraction of its former value. Investors filed class actions, and regulators were still unpacking the mess buried in the Dean archives. What the world didn't know was that Julian wasn't done yet. I found out when Ryan called me one morning, voice tight. He's holding a press conference. Says he's going to set the record straight. I turned on the TV. There he was, standing behind a podium, flanked by American flags and a row of microphones. His hair was sleeked back, suit immaculate, but his eyes were hollow. "I have been vilified," he began, voice steady but brittle. "Certain individuals, disgruntled, unstable, have distorted facts, leaked confidential data, and undermined the faith of our shareholders. I will not rest until the truth is restored." He didn't say my name, but he didn't need to. Every word was aimed at me. The camera flashbulbs turned his face into a strobe of arrogance. I watched him speak about integrity and loyalty, about how disloyal analysts had twisted numbers for personal gain. He lied with the same conviction he used to sell billion-dollar illusions. Ryan called again. "He's baiting you. He wants a reaction." "I'm about to get one," I said. That night, I opened the last encrypted folder from the deep file, one I hadn't touched yet because I'd been afraid of what I'd find. Inside was a chain of emails labeled Client Coordination, Northern Reserve. My breath caught as I read. It wasn't just internal deception. Julian had coordinated false data with outside contractors to manipulate federal reports. Names, dates, attachments, all of it clear as daylight. It wasn't just fraud, it was collusion. I forwarded everything to Dana and the Bureau, including Julian's personal correspondence. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I leaked the email thread. Not to tabloids, not to gossip sites, but to the National Ledger, a paper that still believed in investigative integrity. I didn't hide behind anonymity this time. The article hit within 24 hours. Exclusive, CEO's private emails reveal collusion in Meridian scandal. My name was in the byline as the source. The internet exploded. The public didn't see me as a rogue analyst anymore, they saw me as the whistleblower who refused to stay quiet. Julian's world shattered on live television. Cameras caught him leaving his townhouse as federal agents arrived. No statement, no press spin, just flashing lights and silence. He was charged with securities fraud, data manipulation, and obstruction. The man who once fired me for crossing lines was now crossing courthouse steps in handcuffs. But victory isn't clean. Even as I watched it happen, I felt the exhaustion of everything I'd endured. Months of fear, isolation, character assassination. I'd become both hero and heretic. My reputation might never recover fully. Ryan came over that night with takeout and 2 beers. We sat on my balcony overlooking the river, the air heavy but calm. "You did it. You actually did it," I said. "I exposed him, but I didn't win. Not really." "What do you mean?" "You can't win against corruption. You just slow it down long enough for someone else to notice." He nodded, understanding. "Still," he said, raising his bottle, "you changed the narrative. That's something." I looked out at the city lights, reflections rippling in the water like fractured glass. Somewhere out there, 1,000 other boardrooms were whispering my name, not as a villain or a saint, but as a warning. That was enough. Weeks passed. Hawthorne Meridian began dismantling its leadership, rebranding, promising reforms. The Bureau offered me a consulting position on corporate ethics, a role designed to keep companies from repeating the mistakes I'd exposed. It wasn't redemption, but it was purpose. I took it. My first day there, I walked through the same kind of glass corridors where Julian once ruled, and for a moment I thought about everything that had happened. The firing, the humiliation, the revenge that wasn't meant to be revenge but became it anyway. Truth is rarely clean. It bruises everyone it touches, but it also frees you. That night, I stood by the window of my new office, the city humming below, and thought about his words the day he fired me. "You crossed lines." I smiled to myself. Maybe I had. But someone had to, because if nobody crosses lines, the powerful redraw them until truth disappears altogether. As I shut off the lights, my phone buzzed. An email from Dana. Crowe accepted a plea deal, full admission, sentencing next month. I stared at the screen, exhaling slowly. It was over. Finally, completely over. I stepped into the hallway, the world outside, waiting, cleaner somehow, quieter. And for the first time since that morning in the boardroom, I felt peace. Not the loud, triumphant kind. The quiet kind. The kind that comes when you've told the truth, survived the storm, and walked away still standing. They fired me for crossing lines, but those lines were the map to their own ruin, and I had followed them to the end. The echo stopped. The city exhaled, and I was free.